Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here tonight with us. My name is Rachel Stevens. I'm the volunteer chapter chair for the Sierra Club chapter in Vermont. I also, in my day job, work at the Environmental Justice Clinic at the Vermont Law School as a staff attorney. And we're really excited to welcome some distinguished attorneys into our midst. We have Doug Hayes, Devorah Ancel, and Nathaniel Shoaff, all of who are senior attorneys at the Sierra Club Environmental Law Program. Nathaniel is based in Vermont, but all of the attorneys work on national issues and all actually attended the Vermont Law School. So we have some Vermont connections here, which we're excited about. So I'm going to kick it over to Nathaniel to introduce a little bit about the law program, and then we'll jump right into some of our discussion. So thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, Rachel. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm Nathaniel. I am in Montpelier, just down the road from Rob. With me are two of my classmates from law school, Doug Hayes and Devorah Ancel. Doug's in Boulder. Devorah is right now in Austin. And all three of us graduated in 2007 or thereabouts. And all of us work for the National Sierra Club in our environmental law program. I think I was the last of us to join the law program in 2009. I was probably the 15th or 16th attorney in the law program at that point. And we're now 45 lawyers, I think, maybe 44. We just had a colleague of ours leave to go to the Biden administration. And then we've got about 15 or 16 support staff, which are paralegals and litigation assistants. And we're based mostly in Oakland, California, with a big office in Washington, D.C., a satellite office in Boulder, Colorado, where Doug is based. And then thanks to Devorah's skillful advocacy, there are a handful of us in remote offices like Montpelier and Austin, New York, and Houston, I think, maybe Philadelphia too. So one thing that I should add about the law program is most of us, and certainly for the three of us that are on the call, work on a range of issues, but primarily with a climate-focused lens. And so to the extent that we're giving you a window into the work that the Sierra Club does, it's based on work that's primarily for our national campaigns around either ending fossil fuels or promoting vehicle electrification in one way or another. So in terms of where we're going, I'm going to stop talking in just about a second and give it to Doug to talk about his work. But before I do that, I just want to flag some of the things that they have done, because I don't think Doug or Devorah will do a good job of tooting their own horns for you. Doug cut his teeth on a massive phosphate mine in Florida and has spent the better part of a decade defeating the Keystone XL pipeline. Devorah, among other things, has just recently had a Fifth Circuit argument around endangered species in Texas, and also worked on the Deepwater Horizon spill and successfully fought bomb trains from going through towns in California. So with that short intro, I'll give it to Doug. He's going to talk about some of his work fighting Keystone XL and Dakota Access and some of the other pipelines, with the idea being that each of us will talk a little bit about wins the Biden administration has given us in the first, like 20 days, and then what's ahead, because there's certainly always more work to be done. Doug?
Hey, everyone. Thanks for having us. It's great to talk to you all. Again, Doug Hayes out here in Boulder, Colorado, actually in New Mexico currently. So one thing Nat touched on a little bit, the law program, we all have sort of specific subject matters that we focus on, mostly related to climate change advocacy. There's a lot of our colleagues do, I guess you could call it more demand side work with power plant regulation and things like that. Myself, Devorah, and others, Nathaniel as well to some extent, largely focus more on the supply side, trying to keep the fossil fuels in the ground, midstream pipelines, which is kind of where Keystone XL and some of this stuff comes in. So that's that's a lot of my work is actually on oil pipelines specifically. So there are some of these oil pipelines are proposed to transport tar sands crude oil out of Alberta to the Gulf Coast, where it will be largely used for export. Keystone XL is the biggest one that people have probably heard of. It's been in the news for over a decade now. But the idea is that if we block some of these pipelines, in addition to preventing oil spills and habitat destruction and everything else, it will keep the upstream resource in the ground. The fossil fuel, the tar sands won't be developed as much or as quickly, if at all. And so the Keystone XL, I won't go through the 12-year ups and downs that we've had, but to make a very long story short, we basically won in 2015 with the Obama administration denying the cross-border piece, the permit that approves the pipeline coming from Canada to the U.S. Trump immediately approved it when he was elected, when he took office. And so we've had a series of lawsuits over the last 4 years that has been successful in holding it off. Only 1.2 miles of the pipeline has been built, and that's at the border crossing segment. We've gotten a couple injunctions that have prevented the pipeline from being built to any large extent. And so Biden came into office, and on day one, revoked that cross-border permit, which effectively kills the project. So it was huge. It was a campaign promise that he made, and he lived up to it on day one, which was huge. We have several ongoing lawsuits related to Keystone XL for other parts of the pipeline. Like, for example, the portion that would cross BLM land in Montana. Those lawsuits and then the Montana 401 certification, and a few other. We have a case in the Ninth Circuit on the Army Corps permitting the pipeline. But I think it's safe to say that project is effectively dead. It's just a matter of we'll see how these other remaining lawsuits are resolved. But we think Biden's action, effectively kills the project. So we're very excited about that. The other big tar sands pipeline that we have been fighting for, 6 years now. We actually worked with the Vermont Clinic in 2014, 2015 on a lawsuit related to this, but it's this expansion of an existing pipeline system through the Great Lakes region. The Enbridge Line 3 pipeline is called. That is an existing pipeline that they're trying to double and double the capacity of it from about 570,000 barrels a day to almost 800,000. So it'd be about the same size as Keystone XL. And they would change the route. So it's being built as a replacement to make the pipeline safer. They're going to double the size of it and change the route to go through all sort of undisturbed wetlands and treaty areas that our indigenous allies, some of the tribes that we're working with, are opposing. So we have a state level actually 2 state level challenges challenging the PUC approval and the 401 certification for that project. We also have a federal lawsuit challenging the Army Corps permit, but we've sought injunctions on all those cases and they were denied. So right now it really is up to the Biden administration to act to stop Line 3. The company is racing to build it through the winter as quickly as they can. There's we're litigating and working with again several of our partners, environmental groups, as well as tribes, the White Earth Nation, and Red Lake Band of Ojibwe. There's a lot of sort of on the ground protests happening, people taking direct action and so forth. And the Biden administration really has 2 levers to kill that project. One, The cross-border permit that I mentioned for Keystone XL, it would essentially be the same action. And, you know, the Biden administration is, the rationale that they use to deny Keystone XL should apply equally to Line 3, right? I mean, it makes little sense to take such a strong action on Keystone XL for climate reasons and then allow another pipeline to be built that would be almost as big. So we're trying to get the Biden administration to revoke that permit. And then the Army Corps permit that we're litigating that I mentioned, that the terms of the permit itself, you know, state that the Army Corps can withdraw it at any point if there's, you know, information they didn't consider. And in this case, the Army Corps under the Trump administration approved it without any environmental impact statement. And, you know, I think similarly with a lot of projects in the Trump era, they cut every corner that they could and rushed to get it approved. So we think it makes a lot of sense for the Biden administration to revoke that permit as well, and at least to prepare an environmental impact statement. The last major pipeline that I'll mention is the Dakota Access Pipeline, running from the Bakken to the Gulf Coast, essentially. That pipeline, you know, following all the work in opposition that everyone did in 2016 and 2017 in the you know, historic events at the Standing Rock Reservation. The pipeline, unfortunately, is now built and operating. Trump approved it in his, you know, first days of office as well. And so that the Standing Rock Sioux tribe has been continuing to litigate that approval, and the federal courts have repeatedly ruled that the Army Corps approved that illegally in violation of the National Environmental Policy Act. And so the DC Circuit just 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago affirmed that, ordered the Army Corps to prepare an EIS, environmental impact statement, and affirmed that the easement across the federal land is invalid. So there's this pipeline operating without a legal easement, and it's really up to the Biden administration to decide whether or not to order that pipeline to be shut down pending the preparation of this EIS. So, you know, there's a lot of you know, focus on that nationally right now. You know, trying to get the Biden administration to you know, acknowledge that until the Army Corps goes through the required processes and prepares this EIS, they shouldn't be allowed to continue operating just because the Trump administration rushed to approve it. And then I should say we're also fighting the expansion of Dakota Access at the state level in state courts because there's no federal permit required. But Dakota Access is trying to double the size of it from the existing size of 570,000 barrels a day to about 1.1 million. So it is. So those are kind of the big pipelines. We've won on Keystone XL, but Line 3, Dakota Access are really the two big pipeline fights that we are really hoping the Biden administration will act on here pretty quickly. And then I'll turn it over to Nathaniel or Devorah, but just one last thing. You know, the common theme on a lot of these oil pipelines in particular is the Army Corps. There's no overarching, federal statute governing oil pipeline permitting. So it's really, you know, you have the State Department handles the cross-border piece. The Army Corps has to approve all the water crossings. And we've had a lot of problems with the Army Corps issuing these, you know, streamlined nationwide permits to basically avoid taking any hard look at the impacts of these projects, the climate impacts, and a host of other issues. So we're hoping that we can get the new administration to change the Army Corps' permitting processes. So that's all I have, and I'll turn it over to Nathaniel.
Devorah, thanks, Doug. Devorah, you're up.
All right, thanks. Thanks everyone for being here. Thanks, Doug. So I'm Devorah Ancel, and I am a senior attorney in the environmental law program at the Sierra Club. And my work, as Doug and Nathaniel noted, also focuses on stemming our reliance on fossil fuels through opposition of kind of supply side infrastructure. And I'd say my work focuses within a couple different spheres. First, I manage the Sierra Club's offshore drilling docket, and I also focus my work on oil and to some extent natural gas exports. So I'll touch on those things, and if I have a minute at the end, I'll touch on some lands issues because we thought people might be interested. So with regards to offshore drilling, I manage our legal docket. We do a lot of litigation and advocacy over the last several years, challenging offshore lease sales, exploration and seismic activities, as well as drilling permits. We often do this in coalition with partners and local community groups. I have tended to focus my work on the Gulf of Mexico since it's been much of a sacrifice zone with regards to oil and gas drilling, but we also have work going on in the Arctic as well as along the Atlantic coast. In addition, as Nathaniel mentioned, in 2010, I did a lot of work on our response to the BP oil spill. So I've kind of followed that along. And most recently under the Obama administration, a lot of studies came out on what went wrong there, the heightened risk to the marine environment and of spills and catastrophic spills from deep water drilling. And as a result, the Obama administration strengthened the regulations on offshore drilling safety, and they did a lot of really good stuff with that. And Trump came in and actually repealed most of those rules and completely went in 180 back to kind of pre-BP, basically. So we have had a lawsuit challenging Trump's repeal of those offshore drilling safety rules going on in the courts. And it's still at the early phases of litigation. However, within one day of the Biden administration, he issued a couple orders. One order was this executive order called Protection of Public Health and Environment and Restoring Science and to tackle the climate crisis. And that involves a lot of things, but one of the things it does is they provided a list of regulations that weren't necessarily those midnight regulations that you can kind of automatically repeal because of the late timing of them in the Trump administration, but this was an earlier repeal. So basically Biden has listed a lot of those earlier Trump regulations for review to make sure they're consistent with his new executive order, which calls for reliance on best available science, making sure that it's consistent with public health and environmental protection and environmental justice values. So that repeal of the offshore drilling safety rules is one of those that it will be now under review, which is great. So we're waiting to see what happens with our pending litigation, but I am sure that we'll put that on hold for a little while. Additionally, the Department of Interior put out an order which calls for a 60-day suspension on leasing and drilling permits onshore and offshore. So what that means for offshore is there's an upcoming lease sale, for example, in March that will put that on pause while they're reviewing those and determining next steps with those lease sales and any other pending permits that the agencies are reviewing. Already, there has been an industry challenge to that order by the Western Alliance, I think. It's an industry group. I'm not sure actually what the details of that challenge are. It may be more focused on onshore. It was a simple 2-paragraph petition. So we will see what that involves and if that's something we want to get involved in. So there's a lot of great stuff that has come out immediately with the offshore stuff. Kind of next steps, one of the things that administrations have to do in the offshore world is every 5 years they revise or promulgate a new 5-year outer continental shelf leasing program for the entire OCS, out of continental shelf. Under the Trump administration, they actually had one that they proposed, but it was never finalized. It was fairly controversial because he proposed opening up all of our offshore waters, including California, Alaska, the Atlantic. So that really never got off the ground because states that were Trump-friendly states really pushed back on that. So Biden will be poised to actually promulgate a new 5-year plan. And in that, I think we will engage heavily in terms of focusing on no new lease sales, phasing out existing lease sales, and really working with the administration on kind of a just transition in areas like the Gulf of Mexico that have been heavily reliant on oil and gas industry for the base of their economy as well as for jobs. So that's the offshore realm. I can quickly touch on the exports. Under the Trump administration, we became aware of several proposals to export crude oil. This was kind of happening for 2 reasons. One was the massive expansion of drilling in West Texas in the Permian Basin, oil and gas drilling. It's actually mostly for oil, but there's a lot of gas byproduct coming out too. So there's a need to get that out of the ground as well as to the foreign market because it's really not needed domestically. So we became aware of several proposals to build massive deep water crude export facilities about 20 to 40 miles off the coast of the Gulf of Mexico. About 2 years ago or a year and a half ago, there were 9 such proposals. And the Sierra Club and coalition partners and really community groups that were not aware of what was going to happen in their backyards along the coast quickly became aware and engaged on these. And we have seen, we filed comments, we did a lot of organizing, and now we've whittled it down from 9 to 4 proposals, which is great, but they're still massive. They would have the capacity to export 2 million gallons a day on these massive crude carriers called very large crude carriers, VLCCs. And they are the size of the Empire State Building, just to give you guys kind of the idea of what's going on there. So we still have 4 on the books. The agencies involved with reviewing applications for those deep water ports is the Maritime Administration and the U.S. Coast Guard. So we are waiting to see what will happen with these applications under the Biden administration, given his values and goals with regard to climate and not allowing, hopefully not allowing tons of oil and gas get out of the ground here, as well as get to the world market. So, but there are a few additional things that Biden can do to stop crude oil exports. In 2015, the earlier ban on crude oil exports that was in place from the 70s to 2015 was repealed as part of the Energy Policy and Conservation Act. And basically they said that we can no longer impose restrictions on the export of raw crude oil, unrefined crude oil. With a limited exception of the president being able to impose restrictions in the event of a national emergency. So we will start putting pressure on the Biden administration to exercise that authority, given that the climate crisis is a national emergency, and see what happens there. Additionally, that order that I mentioned earlier that stops onshore and offshore leasing that came out of the Department of Interior also halts for 60 days NEPA review processes and Federal Register publications of final agency action. So like one of these permit approvals for these big export facilities for the next 60 days. So that will buy some time for the Biden administration to do review of those projects, maybe come out with some policies on exports, and allow us to put some pressure on the administration to slow those down, because once those are approved, it's going to lead to a significant amount of exports and additional production. How am I on time? I can stop there if
Yeah, why don't we turn to Nathaniel and then we can
Okay.
circle back depending on
Sure.
how many questions. That's great. Thank you, Devorah. Nathaniel.
Thanks, Rachel, and thanks, Devo and Doug. All right, so real quick on vehicles, because I know that the Vermont chapters spent the last couple of years focusing on vehicle electrification. The good news here is it's pretty much all rainbows and unicorns under the Biden administration. They're going to put the waiver back in place that will allow California to set its own fuel efficiency standards, which for those people who don't know, like that waiver has really driven progress in the auto industry. It's why we have brake lights. It's why we have catalytic converters. It's why everybody wears a seatbelt. And it's why our cars get, 25 to 30 miles to a gallon instead of 15. Biden said Monday he's going to electrify the entire federal fleet of vehicles, which is something like 600,000 automobiles, roughly a third to a half of which are the light duty vehicles like cars and trucks, the wheel drive. They're going to put $30 billion into saving public transit, which is going to mostly save what looked like a $34 billion COVID gap for buses and trains in this country. And lastly, and this is one that I'm personally very excited about, they've committed to installing 500,000 public vehicle chargers in the next 10 years, which is critical because you can't get people to buy electric vehicles unless they think that they can drive them places. And even though most of our charging is going to occur at home, having all of those public charging stations in places that look like gas stations is going to make a big difference in terms of the willingness of people to adopt EVs. The other side of my work is a little bit less rosy. So I work on fossil fuel extraction on public lands, mostly coal, oil, and gas. These are vast billions of tons of fossil fuels that sit underneath national parks and grasslands, marine sanctuaries, monuments like Bears Ears. The reason Bears Ears is a problem is because it has oil and gas underneath it. And the fossil fuel industry wants those resources. The Biden administration took really good action, I think, for the most part, with executive orders in the first several days. The tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad took specific steps to put us back into Paris, including taking steps to define our national contribution to global greenhouse gas emissions. It put in place or directed the Secretary of Interior to put in place a moratorium on oil and gas leasing on public lands. That is great. Public lands account for about 25% of our annual carbon dioxide emissions in the US. So putting a pause on production of new oil and gas leases on public lands will be a huge help. And it's something that we've pushed for a long time. The place where the Sierra Club wants to see our fossil fuels is in the ground. We are a big part of the Keep It in the Ground movement. That is our climate objective when it comes to public lands. There's clearly more work to be done, right? The moratorium on oil and gas leasing onshore and offshore doesn't end. It doesn't end oil and gas production. It just pauses it while the administration studies the environmental and climate impacts of that program. It also doesn't put a pause on federal coal leasing, which is also, because of the market, it's a little less pressing, but it's still a major contributor to climate change. And it's something that I have personally spent a lot of time on. So you can imagine it's a weird feeling to be upset about something when all of your colleagues are like doing backflips and high-fiving each other because the executive order was so good on everything except the one small piece of it that I personally work on. And then lastly, I will just say there are two things that the executive order from the 27th did that I think are really great. One is it directed the administration to put together a working group to address the economic crisis that is facing communities that had become reliant on fossil fuels, either because there's a power plant in that community that employs workers, or because they get a big part of their state and local budgets from royalties that are no longer going to flow to them when we stop mining and drilling for oil and gas and coal on public lands. And then the second thing, which will lead in hopefully to Rachel spending a couple of minutes talking about the environmental justice aspects of what the administration has done, is it directed an interagency working group to come up with a set of proposals to start to address historic environmental injustice. And those two things are, I think, systemic long-term problems that we have to fix. And the reason I really like what the administration is doing there is it's not just what big green environmental groups like the Sierra Club have long asked them to do. It really is looking at real world solutions for workers. It's not enough to say you're going to get a different job. These people have lives, they have kids, they're in school, they have families. It's not fair to someone in Gillette, Wyoming to tell them that they suddenly have to move to Seattle to get a job. You have to find work for them where they are. And I'm really, really excited about that. And Rachel, I'm excited to hear what you have to say about the other environmental justice aspects of what the administration has a lot going.
Thank you. This is so exciting. I feel like, we have the Avengers here with us. You guys really are on the front lines of a lot of the casework. And I just thought I would round out with just a few thoughts on environmental justice. As I mentioned, I work at the Environmental Justice Clinic at Vermont Law School. We do a lot of work with Sierra Club in our casework and supporting them. So that's great. Another aspect of what we do at the Environmental Justice Clinic is civil rights litigation. So in addition to pursuing traditional environmental, using traditional environmental law tools, we also use the Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to bring cases of race discrimination. So in terms of what the Biden administration is doing, they're doing a lot on the environmental front to protect environmental justice communities, but also in the civil rights arena, which is what's really exciting, I think, for EJ advocates, is what's coming over there. So the Biden administration has committed to overhauling the EPA Office of Civil Rights. There are currently a lot of EPA, I would say, is the worst agency in terms of its review of civil rights complaints. If you compare it to the Department of Education or the Department of Transportation, it just pales in comparison. I think they've only made 2 findings of discrimination ever. There's a huge backlog there. So they've committed to overhauling that office, which is great. My boss actually was just pegged to be the Deputy General Counsel for Environmental Initiatives, and she's like a guru in civil rights. So that's very exciting for us in terms of the signals that the administration is sending in that office. So that's exciting. In terms of other structural changes, the Biden administration is elevating and reestablishing 2 environmental justice advisory councils to now be in directly reporting to the White House. So that's really exciting in terms of the what was the previously the NEJAC will now be a White House Advisory Council, which would directly report to the President and the Council of Environmental Quality. Procedurally, there's some exciting stuff too going on in terms of updating, like using science and data. So there's updates that already have been undertaken and are going to be continued to update the EJ mapping tool, which is a tool that agencies and communities can use to consider cumulative impacts. And there's talk in the environmental justice communities about how to make sure that that includes like monitoring data in real time and is ground truthed by communities. And then also there's some of the substantive changes, as Devorah mentioned. Executive Order 13990 includes considerations of public health, climate, and environmental injustice. And we've already seen, in addition to the list of agency actions that you mentioned, Devorah, that are currently under review and the rules that are under review, it also requires each agency to create a list within 30 days of any action that presents obstacles to the objectives, including environmental justice. So EJ advocates have been actively, sending either formal petitions for reconsideration to EPA for any actions that are the Trump administration had taken that might be inconsistent with those goals, and also, sending those to the agency heads there for reconsideration. So that's some of the updates. Another thing to keep an eye on is, I know this isn't the Biden administration directly, but Congress is currently considering a few EJ laws, which would actually overhaul and do a lot of good for environmental justice. So definitely keep an eye out for that. The EJ for All Act, and there's another one as well. I can put the links in the chat. But those are really exciting. And in this political climate, there's some good action that could happen on the civil rights front. So with that, I want to turn it over to Q&A. So you can put your question in the chat for anybody, or you can just maybe raise your hand and unmute yourself and ask your question directly. I see a question from Steve. Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So it's there in the chat. We hear a lot about people taking off, just the good people leaving the agencies over the last 4 years, being forced out, whole agencies being moved from one part of the country to another. And that seems to me like one of the biggest challenges. Were you able to see that happening, and has you seen any rebuilding happening?
Well, I'll go first, and then I'll turn it over to Doug and Devorah. Steve, you're right. There's been a huge drain of the federal workforce. The Bureau of Land Management, which covers oil and gas on public lands, moved from DC to just outside of Denver during the Trump administration. A ton of people left BLM there. The Council on Environmental Quality, which promulgates the NEPA regulations, or the National Environmental Policy Act regulations, they're the things that I rely on when I challenge oil and coal leases on public lands. It's what Doug used to invalidate the Keystone XL pipeline. Though the problem there is that CEQ, the Council on Environmental Quality, which makes those regulations, is going to be reversing Trump administration rollbacks. They're not, they haven't done anything yet, not because they can't find the light switches. It's because they don't have bodies to turn those light switches on and off. So that's one specific area where CEQ has been absolutely gutted. They don't yet have a director. She's been nominated. She has not yet been confirmed. That's an agency that is going to have a lot of work ahead, and they're not going to have bodies to do it. It's going to take them a long time, I think, to staff up adequately. But that's just one example. Doug and Devo?
Yeah, the only thing I'd add is, just to reiterate what Nat said and Nathaniel said, a lot of there's a lot of outreach to the different agencies going on right now. And I mean, some of them are basically, they don't even have computers yet or phone lines. I mean, I think the extent to which the Trump administration was able to really dismantle the functionality of these agencies, I think is enormous. But I mean, so I think it'll take some time. And then of course, getting all the political appointees in place will take a little bit of time. But I'm encouraged by the hires that we've seen so far. It seems like the Biden administration is, putting a lot of good people in place as quickly as they can.
I don't have too much to add. I mean, I'd provide the Department of Justice attorney angle in terms of like opposing counsel in my cases in the last 4 years. I think those were mostly holdovers from the Obama administration. And even though they couldn't say too much, I think they were just trying to buy the time so that they could stay in their jobs. But I sensed frustration during it. But I haven't seen a lot of change in at least DOJ, but maybe at the higher levels, obviously, but kind of the frontline attorneys, maybe not as much. But yeah, I agree. I am very encouraged by the recent appointments though at higher levels. But yes, they're gonna have to staff up quickly.
Okay, Devo, you have led me to a question. Rachel, is it okay if I
Oh, go
jump
for
in
it,
really
yeah.
quick? All right, so the three of us have spent a lot of time the last 4 years challenging Trump administration policies. When you do that, you sue whatever the federal agency is, Department of Energy, Army Corps. With the exception of FERC, almost all of those agencies use the Department of Justice to defend what the agency has just done. I'm going to be in a really weird position where I'm suddenly going to be intervening to defend Biden administration policies that I like with precisely the same Department of Justice lawyers that I've just spent 4 years fighting over bad Trump administration policies with. Are you two going to be in a weird position too? Like, is that going to be uncomfortable for you? Because I've found the Department of Justice brain drain, Steve, to get back to your earlier question, to be significant, and that the lawyers that they've hired, I think, that handle district court litigation are by and large industry hacks. They're willing to engage in climate denial. I don't like any of them on a personal level. And now I'm going to be working with them on the same side of case. So Devo and Doug, I'm curious to hear your perspective on that.
I don't think I have had the same experience as you in the last 4 years. I think that I happen to have people who were there from before, and as I said, who showed some frustration. So I actually, and I've had good working relationships with them, but they may have not been as on as kind of contentious issues or like in the forefront of the Trump administration. So they didn't have those heavy hitter industry lawyers on those cases. Doug, you may have a different experience with Keystone because that was.
No, I don't think I've had the same experience as Nathaniel either. I mean, it really depends on the case and the DOJ lawyers, but I mean, I would say the majority of them that I've dealt with, their job is to defend the, Trump permit and the processes, and a lot of the time they're indefensible and they're doing the best they can, but you can tell their heart isn't really in it. So, it's usually oftentimes the interveners that, the pipeline companies that are way more aggressive and taking absurd positions. So my personal experience, I don't think that'll be too awkward for me either.
I am very, very happy to hear that. And Rachel, looks like you had more to add.
Oh, I was just going to say one of the DOJ lawyers that left the Trump administration now works at our clinic. So it's kind of funny to get her perspective. Any other questions from folks in the audience? Claire, one of our clinicians. Not current, former clinician. Claire, do you want to ask your question? Do you want me to read?
I could ask it. I think it's a little strange the way I wrote it. So this question comes up with Nathaniel. You mentioned the massive investment into our EV fleet. And I'm curious if you think that it's possible to be able to use those EVs, for example, when they're not in use, as an alternative storage facility to help, like a battery storage to help grid modernization.
In the long term, yes. I think in the short term, the place so in order to do the thing that Claire's talking about, your battery has to go two ways, right? It can't just be that you plug your car in at your house and you get electricity from the grid. In order to do the thing that Claire's talking about, your car then has to be able to plug in and give electricity back to the grid when it's needed. That technology, that vehicle to grid capability, the technology's there right now. I think the place that's going to be useful is with school buses, where we've got a huge fleet of school buses in this country. They mostly sit idle for large parts of the day. And the challenge, I think, with doing that sort of bi-directional flow for light duty vehicles like what you and I drive is that it's going to, doing that sort of reverse flow back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, it's going to probably eliminate the warranty on most light duty vehicle batteries right now. And then because of that, I think you're going to see a lot of resistance to individual EV drivers not wanting to eliminate their own warranty.
Bill, I see you have a question. Do you want to ask it or do you want me to read it? Oh, you're on mute. Bill, you're on mute. Bill.
I'll ask it. I'm constantly asking this question. It's always about, the supercharger system in this country. And, I was on the transportation policy advisory group for the Biden campaign. And, we talked about this, but I just didn't know where it was going to go. And I go back to the Shumlin administration where I brought some automotive industry people up to Montpelier, and they even offered they were from two German companies, to start building Quebec to Massachusetts, and it all fell apart. I just don't know what the problem is. I know that the Biden administration is going to speed it up, but you can't buy any car but a Tesla and go anywhere. And believe me, I have them all. And I've been stuck a lot, and it's just crazy. There's $14 million from the VW settlement, and it was supposed to be distributed to the states to start building this thing. Tesla could build them in a month. What is wrong? I mean, it's stalled this entire industry, and therefore it's stalled our ability to deal with carbon. Vermont in the last 3 years was the only state with rising CO2. And I assume that's because everybody needed an F-150, but I was not proud of that.
Rivian's going to take us there, Bill.
Or-
Yeah, so the type of charging, for those that aren't sort of steeped in this, in the way that Bill is, there are a couple of different types of charging. They're commonly called level 1, 2, or 3. Level 3 is sort of like the thing that could replace a gas station, right? You fill up your whole car in 20 minutes, half an hour. And in order to facilitate sort of long distance travel, you want to go from Vermont to New York to see relatives, which I do occasionally. I'd probably have to stop once. And even if I had a Tesla, I'd probably have to stop once. And I know because I have a sister-in-law who drives up here from Brooklyn, and she stops in southern Vermont and fills up once in Brattleboro. So I think, how do we get there? Yes, the VW settlement. VW basically cheated on their emissions tests. They made it look like their cars were more efficient than they weren't. Their penalty for doing that was to set up this big fund that states could use for vehicle electrification. Only 15%, under the terms of the settlement, states could only spend 15% of those dollars that they received under the settlement on public charging infrastructure, like the sort of charging stations Bill's talking about. How do we get there? I think is we leverage the power of the federal government. And the more that you ramp up the amount of electric vehicles on the road, the more you're going to incentivize and catalyze that private market to generate these charging stations. Right now, we're at like 0.5% of the EV sales in this country or vehicle sales in this country are EVs. We have a chicken and egg problem. Are the level 3 charging stations going to show up when you have EVs, or are people going to buy EVs once there's a sufficient charging station in place? And I think that is the thing that we are all working on that are advocates in this space, Bill. And Rob, I think you have more to add.
Yeah, so Bill, to give you some Vermont context to that, the Vermont Volkswagen settlement funds are basically almost depleted, where they use a lot of the money to promote level 2 charging, where they had grant programs. And then they also were doing a high-speed program where they were trying to get a level 3 charger within 30 miles of every single Vermonter. Now they're starting to think about maybe doubling up that. And I'm going to say in the governor's budget for this year, he proposed $1 million for EV infrastructure and charging facilities. Also, some of the House transportation members had proposed money for that. So the transportation committee is debating about that, and maybe even using some more federal money to promote a lot of the more extensive thing about having that high-speed network of EV charging. So, but they're working on it and looking on expanding that, and we're hoping to get a lot of that efforts in Vermont.
Can I mention one thing? I work with a guy, I'm a filmmaker sometimes, and I work with a guy named Roger Sorkin, who started the American Resilience Project. He's in Northampton. Really good filmmaker. He's done stuff, he's looked at climate from a lot of different directions. His latest film, which he's finishing right now, and he's going to have a sneak preview next week, is part of his Current Revolution series. It's called Nation in Transition. And it's about literally blowing up the Arizona coal plant on Navajo land, and how the utility had the foresight and the sensitivity to actually give every one of those Navajo workers a new job in building, installing, and creating solar fields. And it's a great win-win story. So look out for it.
Yeah, Bill, if you can put that information in the chat, if you have a link, or we'd be glad to share that with folks.
Okay, yeah, I will look for a link.
Do other people? Oh, Adam.
Hey, everybody. I just wanted to introduce myself because I'm like the new guy here. So my name's Adam Joseph. I'm a Florida attorney that just recently relocated to Vermont. So I also started practicing in 2007, like many of you said you did, early on in the call. I've been practicing civil litigation for all of these years. I'm basically a mediator now, so I'm not really interested in the litigation side. The reason I came up to Vermont, because, Florida's laws are pretty terrible. And I think there's a lot of opportunity up here. So I don't know quite, what kind of contribution I can make, but I am still in the middle of transitioning out of my, so it's been very helpful to all the good work that you're doing. It sounds like, there's a lot of things I'm interested in, certainly locally in Vermont. So Bill, and I think Rob, I think you'd definitely be interested in either advocacy or, some type of maybe lobbying work, something I could do to contribute, in those areas. But
Yeah, Adam, we'd love to plug you in. We do have several active teams. We have a energy team. Oh, sorry.
And my video's been a little choppy, so
no, that's okay. I didn't mean to cut you off.
If I'm like breaking in now.
I didn't mean to cut you off. Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. My internet's a little funny here, so.
Well, I was just gonna mention we should definitely stay in touch, Adam. We have an active transportation team that's doing advocacy in the state. Nathaniel obviously works here in Vermont, but also on national transportation issues. So we get the benefit of Nathaniel's help in Vermont and also nationally. And we also have some local energy teams and other groups too. So we'd love to plug you in and we'll get your information.
Yeah, absolutely. And one last thing, how long do you all have this meeting? Is this a regular weekly meeting, or is this just kind of a one-off with environmental attorneys?
This is a one-off, but we would definitely, I think there is actually a group of lawyers that's been meeting in the state on some energy issues. So I could plug you into that group for a more like advocacy focus. But we do have this event every Wednesday at 7:00, usually on different topics with different speakers. But we'd love to plug you in a more regular way.
I mean, I'm in the Burlington area, so I know Vermont's not a very big place. You can drive across it pretty quickly, but I'm in Colchester, so that's where I am. So I don't know if there's others like me around here, but.
Yeah, we'll plug you in, Adam. We know all the lawyers in Vermont.
Cool.
We'll get you set up.
Cool.
Welcome.
I appreciate it. All right. Thank you.
Other questions for Doug and Devorah and Nathaniel about the work or what this means for the next 4 years at least?
All right.
I guess Claire, go for it.
Yeah, I have one more question. So about I'm trying to think, what was it called? The tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad, and then some of the other executive orders that have come out. Specifically, I'm thinking about the moratorium recently. I'm just curious what you think about how strong some of those provisions are to legal challenges. For example, you mentioned Wyoming, and I think recently that the Attorney General is talking about a lawsuit to challenge so the provisions, especially because they're saying it kind of happened really quickly, and a lot of people are worried about how it's going to affect the local economy.
I have very strong views on this one, Claire, but I will also then let Doug and Devo fill in. So right before we got on this call, I was working on what we call a new matter form. It's basically an internal approval memo. Nice cat. That will allow the Sierra Club to intervene as a defendant in Western Energy Alliance's lawsuit. As Devo
Is he breaking up?
Filed in the federal district court. Sorry if my internet's cutting out. Basically, I think their lawsuit has no chance of success. They challenged an executive order that didn't do anything other than direct the secretary to take action. The acting Secretary of the Interior has not taken that action. There's no chance that their case would survive a mootness challenge right now. It might in the future once the secretary acts, but I don't I don't see a lot of joy for them, given the wide discretion to the Secretary of Interior to lease oil and gas under the Mineral Leasing Act. So I feel very confident about our ability to defend a future secretarial order that has not happened yet, even if we have to do it in places like the District of Wyoming or the Eastern District of Texas, or Devorah, if you think an offshore group will file in Louisiana. I mean, these are fairly unfavorable forums for environmental groups. But in this particular instance, you know, one thing that we saw during the Trump administration is that some of our institutions are really resilient, and the courts are one of them. Devo, for the glasses half empty view.
I mean, I really don't have much to add on that, and I'd agree. I mean, nothing's happened. It's a 60-day temporary suspension, asking the agency heads to review. So I'd agree. I haven't put as much thought into it probably as you have, Nathaniel.
No. But yeah, and the fact that their press release had more information than their complaint did is telling you about where Western Energy Alliance is at.
If only we could get paid those rates for some of the briefs I've seen.
No.
Other questions for the panelists? We've got about 4 minutes left. They may hang around if anyone has another question. I guess I would ask the panelists, is there anything that hasn't happened yet that you're hoping for, or that an action that you're waiting for from the Biden administration, or something that you'd like to see that you think that they could do that would have a big impact? I know there was a flurry of activity so far, but is there something on the horizon, or maybe something to hope for?
Well, I can speak to that. I mean, I mentioned the couple Dakota Access and Line 3. Those are obviously things in my world that are we're anticipating. But I think a lot of, similar to the oil and gas leasing on federal lands, a lot of the initial actions were, sort of temporary reviews of, 60-day. For example, there's a memo from the chief of staff, doing a regulatory freeze on all, last minute regulations, and even some of the regulations that and rules that have been finalized and not yet taken effect. So there's a lot of things that the monuments, I think others have mentioned that, but my understanding is that it's a 60-day review period to make recommendations on what to do about the monuments. So a lot of those things we're hoping will, result in firm actions, but they just haven't happened yet.
I think I touched on most of mine, but I think it'll be interesting to see how far Biden will go with a new 5-year leasing plan. Like, will he actually take some strong action in the Gulf of Mexico, which we've never seen under any administration? And really, is there going to be some sort of steps for a just transition there? And I didn't get to touch on the lands issues, but I will say that his executive order is likely going to put back in place the expansions of several national monuments that Obama had put in place and Trump repealed, which were Bears Ears, Staircase Escalante, and the Northeast Seamount. So I think, hopefully we'll see more kind of strong action on land protections as well.
Nathaniel, do you want to add to this wish list? things that could happen?
My wish list is for the federal judiciary. I think it's time to end this idea that if you work for an advocacy group like Sierra Club, you shouldn't be on the federal bench. But if you work for, say, a big law firm representing oil and gas interests, that's fine, because all you were doing was representing a client's interest. And the social license of fossil fuels needs to end. Federal government needs to get out of that business of leasing fossil fuels to the highest corporate bidder, and we need to start filling some federal district court seats.
Well said. So I think we are going to turn off the recording here because we're at 8 o'clock and we want to respect everyone's time. But also this, if folks want to hang around for just a few minutes, we can continue the conversation. I also wanted to mention, Adam, that Judith is a recent transplant from Florida. She put a comment in the chat there. Also may be interested in engaging. So there you go. You have a connection already.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
And Rob, I don't know if you wanted to mention some of our, upcoming conversations.
Actually, Steve is going to tell us about the environmental advocacy and racial justice because he facilitated it, setting it up. So Steve, are you there?
I am here. Yeah, I think this is going to be a great discussion next week. We have Hop Hopkins, who is now the Director of Organizational Transformation for National Sierra Club. And we have Kaya Morris, who's a former legislator in Vermont, who's now with Rights and Democracy, and Lisa Ryan, who is Rutland alderman, who are going to join us talking about the challenges of becoming a less racist society from the lens of a mostly white environmental group. So it should be a very interesting discussion. Please join us. Rob?
Good. And then also on the 24th, we're going to do a discussion with another Sierra Club national employee, Rachel Golden of the Building on Electrification campaign. But then we're also going to include Jack Hansen of the city of Burlington, who has a couple ballot initiatives. So join us for that conversation as well.
Thank you so much to our panelists. We really appreciate your time and all the work that you're doing. I think there's a lot of love coming in on the chat for all the advocacy that you've done. And we really owe a great deal of debt to all of your work, and we appreciate you. So thank you so much.